Thank you for joining us for worship today. We are continuing our Lives of Faith series, and we're looking at the book of Ruth today. So the book of Ruth, as you open up your Bible and you'll go through Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, you will hit the book of Ruth there. And it's a short book. It's only 4 chapters, and we're going to go through the whole of the book. We're not going to read all of the book. We're going to pick out some of the highlights of this book and look at Ruth's story and some of the hardship that she has been through and the example of faith that we see in Ruth that we can learn from today. And so I'm going to read from Ruth chapter 1, and it'll set the context of this book and our understanding of it. It will also be on the screen. During the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land. A man left Bethlehem in Judah with his wife and 2 sons to stay in the territory of Moab for a while. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They entered the field of Moab and settled there. Naomi's husband, Elimelech, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Her sons took Moabite women as their wives. One was named Orpah, and the second was named Ruth. They lived in Moab about 10 years. Both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was left without her 2 children and without her husband. So this opening sets the context of what's going on. We open with Elimelech and Naomi who live in Bethlehem, and a famine has hit the land, and that means there is no bread in the house of bread. That's what Bethlehem means, the house of bread. And so they have to move. They have to migrate away in order to survive, in order to have sustenance, in order to live. They move to another nation. They move to Moab, where things are better. There is no famine. And so they move there. They intend to stay there for a while, but they end up staying there for quite a long time. And so they move to Moab, but quickly after they move, a disaster hits. The disaster is Elimelech dies. We're not told what happens. We're not told how it happens, but he dies. And that is painful, and that is hard for Naomi, but at least she has her 2 sons. That means she will be okay. Her sons will look after her, particularly her firstborn. One of the reasons why in the Old Testament, the firstborn son got a double portion of the inheritance to everyone else was the expectation was the firstborn would look after their parents. And so the double portion, everyone else could spend their own money. All the other children could spend their money and their inheritance on what they liked. The firstborn had some of their own inheritance, but their double portion was to ensure they looked after the parent who remained. They had a responsibility. And so Naomi still has her 2 sons, which means she will be okay. And the 2 sons, they grow and they get married and they marry Moabite women. And things are okay for a while, except 10 years in, both sons die. And that means Naomi and her daughters-in-law are in a precarious position in the ancient Near East. Because without a husband and her sons, without her daughter-in-law having any children, they are left in a precarious position as women in the ancient Near East. Because the husbands and the sons would have brought financial security through their work in the fields and in the markets. And so they're in a difficult place. There are 3 tragedies that hit this family over a 10-year period. And as we've gone through this series of Lives of Faith, I don't know if you've picked up a repeated theme, but a repeated theme through all the people we've looked at is life is hard. Life is difficult sometimes. Every person we've went through has had some trauma, some pain, some suffering, something that has happened in their life. Let me give you some encouraging words from Jesus. This is what Jesus says to his disciples in John 16:33. I have told you these things so that you may have peace. You will have suffering in this world. Not you might have, or occasionally, it's you will have suffering in this world. But be courageous, I have overcome the world. Church, we've got to realize life is hard. Particularly if you're younger and you've not had trauma or difficulty or suffering come to your life, you will go through hardship in life. There will be difficulty, there will be pain, there will be some suffering that comes in life. That is just going to happen. There's no escape from it. There's no way around it. Pain will come to every door. Every person that's sitting in a seat here will face pain and difficulty and suffering in their life at some point. There's no way around that. There's nothing we can do about that. That is just a reality. And if we don't have that as a reality, if we don't have the recognition that life is hard, if we kind of live in a bubble that thinks, well, God, I'm with God, God is with me, God blesses me, everything should go swimmingly. If we live in a bubble or a mindset like that, and we don't realize life is hard, it makes going through the hard stuff even harder. Because we're living with this disappointment and this level of stuff not being real. And thinking we've done something wrong, thinking that something has gone wrong in our life because we're going through hardship. Listen, hardship will come. Life is hard. For me, I learned life was hard quite early on. We grew up at the tail end of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and stuff was still going on. And when I was about 7, so 1993, BBC have launched this thing called BBC Archive. You can look back over lots of news reports for the last, I think it's 50 years or something on this BBC Archive site. And so I searched last week for something that happened back in 1993 at our school. So there's a courthouse near our school. There was a courthouse, there's a Southern Education and Library Board over here, there's a Dole office over here, there's a technical college, there's a grammar school, and there was my primary school. And the IRA planted a 1,000-pound bomb outside the courthouse in Armagh that went off in the early hours of, I think, the 3rd of September, if memory serves me right. And this 1,000-pound bomb went off, blew the courthouse up, blew the Southern Education Library Board. I'm assuming they didn't want their kids going to school or didn't like schools. Blew up the Dole office, so they didn't want any money. But they also blew up the 3 schools, or blew the windows out of the 3 schools at least. And so we had, at that time, wasn't complaining. We had some time off school while they had to tidy everything up. But we grew up knowing life was hard. My dad was an alcoholic. My mum has MS and is disabled. From really early on, we knew life was hard. And sometimes we just need a reality check that church life is hard. Parenting is hard. Marriage is hard. Work is hard. Employers are hard. Friends can be hard. Sometimes church can be hard. But life is hard. Sometimes we need to know that because Naomi and Ruth and Orpah go through hardship. They all face this hardship. Elimelech has no brothers. Naomi has no other children. Her daughter-in-laws, Ruth and Orpah, have no children. They are left in an impossible situation. And so, needing community support, Naomi decides, I'm going to go back to Bethlehem. Because I know in Israel, they will look after me. There'll be fields that I can glean from. There will be provision made for me. The community will support me, so I'm going back. And she wants to release her daughters-in-law from any responsibility they have for her. So she says to Orpah and to Ruth, listen, you're no longer responsible. You don't have to come with me. I'm releasing you from my responsibility. Go back home. Go back to your parents. Get remarried. Go and make a new life somewhere else. Be released from responsibility to me. I will look after myself. And Orpah takes her up on that offer. She returns home. But Ruth, on the other hand, this is what we read about Ruth in verse 15. Naomi said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Follow your sister-in-law. But Ruth replied, don't plead with me to abandon you or return and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me and do so severely if anything but death separates you from me. And when Naomi saw Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped talking to her. I don't think stopped talking to her completely. I don't think she was falling out with her and saying, oh, I really didn't want you to come. Now I'm stuck with you forever. Just stopped talking to her about that matter, that she had made up her mind. And one of the things we see out of the tragedy and out of the hardship that they go through is faith is birthed in Ruth. The hardship has a way of bringing us to faith, bringing faith out of us in the midst of the trouble and in the midst of the trauma, that God uses the pain that we go through to place faith in him. Think of all the people that come to Jesus. Why do they come to Jesus? Often people are coming to Jesus with a request because they're in hardship. Their children are sick or dying. They've got a personal problem. Someone has died. A servant is sick. A relative is sick. Someone is possessed with evil spirits. They're hungry. There are reasons they come to Jesus, and the reason is the pain or the trauma or the suffering that they're in has caused them to place their faith into him as the solution to their pain. And pain is a way of bringing us to God. Pain is a way of awakening us that we within ourselves, we have no capacity. We are not in control. We are finite. We cannot control our whole lives and the whole circumstance we go through. It is beyond us, and we need to trust God. And in the midst of this pain and this sorrow and this hardship that they are going through, faith is birthed in Ruth. She makes a decision. I'm going with you. I'm going to your land. I'm going to your people. Your God will be my God. In their mindset of that day, the gods controlled different territories. So the area was controlled by a Philistine god. Israel was controlled by Yahweh. Moab was controlled by Moabite gods. That was kind of the thinking in those cultures around Israel. And so in saying, your people will be my people, your God will be my God, Ruth is rejecting her heritage. She's rejecting where she's come from. She's rejecting the customs. She's rejecting the gods of her father and her forefathers. And she's saying, I trust Yahweh alone. I trust Yahweh, who is my creator. I trust the God of Israel to be my provider. I trust that he will make everything right for us. And I'm coming with you. And out of the hardship and out of the suffering, faith in God is birthed. She is prepared to leave everything. And Naomi sees her determination. And here's the reality. Hardship has a way of forging within us determined faith. Hardship has a way of giving birth to faith that is resolute and determined. And so Ruth makes a decision. She is determined, and this determined faith has been birthed by hardship. And that's what often draws people to God, when we realize that we are finite and we can't control everything. That doesn't just happen for us with faith. Think about this practically in the world. Who are the people that most often found charities for raising money for cancer research? People who've been through cancer or have had a relative that's gone through cancer. Or what about knife crime? Who are the people who work to eradicate knife crime and get knives off our streets? People who've been touched by knife crime. Either their children have been harmed, they've been harmed, or they've been involved in gang culture sometimes. Who is it that really put the work into marriage resources to help people strengthen their marriages and ensure their marriages can last the distance? People who've been through difficult marriages. Often it's the stuff that we go through that gives us a determination and a passion that brings fruit out in that area, and it awakens within us a determination. And in the context of faith, hardship can awaken a determined faith. And in Ruth's situation, that determined faith leads to the hope of redemption. So they move back to Bethlehem. They move back to the house of bread. The famine is over. They move back. They are returning. And Ruth is diligent. She feels a responsibility to her mother-in-law. The mother-in-law no longer has a son, but she is going to go in the fields and she is going to do the work. So she goes to a field, and in ancient Israel, the Torah, as we will read in Leviticus 19, states that you're not allowed to harvest every piece of grain in your field. In fact, this is what it says. When you reap the harvest of your land, you are not to reap to the very edge of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not strip your vineyard bare of its fallen grapes. Leave them for the poor and the resident alien. I am the Lord your God. The Torah is giving ethical principles of how the community is to look after one another. It's not that you use up everything that you have. You maximize the profit of every field that you have. You've got a social responsibility to people in your community to leave enough in your fields that others can live and survive and make food without resorting to begging or without resorting to being demeaned. There was a humanizing way of leaving enough in each field that people in the community could in a humane way, in a non-dehumanizing way, ensure that people were being looked after. And so Ruth goes out to do this. She goes out to glean. She goes out to take some of what was left over to ensure that her and Naomi could live because they were vulnerable. It's an important reflection for us in the 21st century who are really living in a dominant consumer society that says maximize for businesses, maximize the profits you can get for your workers, rinse as many hours out of them as you get, spend as much money on yourself as you can. It's an important slap in the face to go, actually, church, we've got a social responsibility to the world around us, to not use everything on ourselves, and to not rinse every hour out of everybody that we can. That productivity is not the chief end of our society. It's that we are image bearers who reflect the image of God, and we're to love one another. And so Ruth goes into the field and she gleans, and she bumps into a man named Boaz, who will become a really important figure for them, and he happens to be a relative of Elimelech. And so let's read about her encounter with Boaz in Ruth 2, verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter, don't go and gather grain in another field, and don't leave this one, but stay here close to my female servants. See which field they are harvesting and follow them. Haven't I ordered the young men not to touch you? When you are thirsty, go and drink from the jars the young men have filled." She fell face down, bowed to the ground, and said to them, "Why have I found favor with you, so that you notice me, although I am a foreigner?" Boaz answered her, "Everything you have done for your mother-in-law since your husband's death has been fully reported to me. How you left your father and mother and your native land, and how you came to a people you didn't previously know. May the Lord reward you for what you have done, and may you receive a full reward from the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Her faithful determination to follow Yahweh leads her into Yahweh being, in verse 12, the one under whose wings you have come for refuge. Her faith has led to a sense of refuge as she encounters Boaz, because Boaz is more than just a relative. Boaz will become a really important figure because Boaz is what is called a kinsman or a family redeemer. And a kinsman redeemer played a really important role in Israelite society. That if there was a situation like this, where there was a widow who was left with her husband had died and she has no sons, it puts her into a really precarious position. And both Naomi and Ruth are in this position. They have no male relatives. And so they are open to people trying to take advantage of them, but also they have no heirs and they have no financial protection. What a kinsman redeemer would do would be there would be a close relative who would often marry the widow, and the children that they had would be children thought of as from the line of the first husband. And so those children would inherit the full estate of the deceased relative. Their family line would go on, the land that they had would go on, and it would ensure that the widow was financially stable. And Boaz is their kinsman redeemer. And we read in verse 19 how it says this: her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you gather barley today? Where did you work? May the Lord bless the man who noticed you. Ruth told her mother-in-law, whom she had worked with, and said, "The name of the man I work with is Boaz." Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May the Lord bless him, because he has not abandoned his kindness to the living or to the dead." Naomi continued, "The man is a close relative. He is one of our family redeemers." And so in doing this, he picks up the mantle of a family redeemer, and there's 4 important aspects to it. The one is they redeem property. So a kinsman redeemer, a family redeemer, could act on behalf. So sometimes property was lost. Maybe they've had to sell it to pay off a debt. Maybe they've had to sell it because they can no longer look after it, or they need to survive. And so a widow might have to sell the land that she has. A kinsman redeemer can buy that land back to ensure that it stays within the family's lineage and it goes on to bless future generations. So they can act as someone who can buy it back to ensure it stays in the family. A second thing they can do is sort out wrongdoings. So if, for example, a relative commits unintentional manslaughter, a kinsman redeemer could act to protect the family's name. They can step in, they can be part of the justice process, and they can pay recompense, or they can figure out a way of giving recompense to the victim's family to ensure that everything is done right. They will often marry a widow to continue the family line, and we see that in Deuteronomy 25. And this ensures the family line is preserved and that the inheritance is passed down through that generation. A final thing they can do is buy relatives out of slavery. There wasn't a welfare state, so when people fell on hard times, often, once they'd sold their property and sold whatever they had to sell themselves into slavery for 7 years. And after the 7 years, they would be released from that bondage. A kinsman redeemer can pay for them to come out of that early, and they can liberate them. They can set them free from that slavery. It's a beautiful example to us of what the gospel is. That Jesus is our kinsman redeemer. As we come up to Christmas and we think about Jesus' incarnation, this is what he does. Jesus becomes our close relative. How? By taking on humanity. Jesus becomes one of us, so that he can be the one who redeems us. He can be the one who sets us free. He can be the one who buys us back. He can be the one who brings us into the family of God. And so when we celebrate communion in a moment, the bread is a reminder to us that Jesus took on humanity, that he could be our close relative, that he could be our kinsman redeemer. And he redeems us when we take the cup by his blood, by dealing with our sin, by washing it away, by giving his life. That is the gospel. That is a beautiful image of the gospel, what God does for us. And if you're not a believer, that is what the gospel is. That is what God is offering to you. And my question is, have you received that yet, and have you trusted him? Because in Boaz meeting Ruth, she's met the kinsman redeemer, the closest relative who will fulfill that role. And Ruth's determined faith has led her to this moment of provision, this moment of hope, this moment of redemption. And so Ruth goes and she tells Naomi about this. And they say that Boaz is going to sort out their redemption. He is going to do it, and there will be a process to that. And they want that over quickly. The reality is, for us all, when we are going through suffering and pain, we want that to be done as quickly as possible. We want to go to bed one night and wake up the next morning and it's all done. It's all sorted. It's all fixed. It's gone away. Life doesn't work like that, does it? One day goes into the next. One bad day moves into the next. And life is hard. And Naomi gives this advice that I remember receiving a number of times as a pastor that I had called Bob McMullen. And when I would go to him wanting advice, particularly if I was impatient about something, he would share this verse with me time and time again, to the point I knew what he was going to say when I asked him for advice, because I knew what was, when you get to know somebody enough that this is just what they're going to say. And this is what the verse says in verse 18 of chapter 3. Naomi said, "My daughter, wait until you find how things go, for he won't rest until he resolves it today." Pastor Bob always quoted it in the King James Version. Let me read the King James Version to you, because I think it puts it slightly better. It says this: "Sit still, my daughter, until thou know how the matter will fall. For the man will not rest until he has finished the thing this day." And Bob always used to say, when I asked him anything, sit still and see how the matter may fall. For many of us, that's what we need to do. We need to take our hands off the wheel. We need to take our hands off the controls. We need to take our hands off us trying to sort something out, and we need to sit still and see how everything will play out. Because I have no control over my future. You have no control over your future. You've got to sit still sometimes and let God be God. You've got to sit still and let Jesus take the wheel. And sit still and see how the matter will fall. It's a call to trust God with our pain, with our hardship, with our suffering. It's a call to allow him to be God. But in our determined faith and in meeting the Redeemer, the kinsman Redeemer who will come to set her and Naomi free, we find a new future emerges. And we're going to read that in chapter 4, verses 11 to 17. And so Boaz goes to redeem Ruth. And it says this: all the people who were sitting at the city gate, including the elders, said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is entering your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built the house of Israel. May you be powerful in Ephrathah, and your name be well known in Bethlehem. May your house become like the house of Perez, the son of Tamar, who bore Judah, because of the offspring the Lord will give you by this young woman." Boaz took Ruth. She became his wife. He slept with her, and the Lord granted conception to her, and she gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you without a family redeemer today. May his name become well known in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in old age. Indeed, your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Naomi took the child, placed him on her lap, and became a mother to him. The neighbor women said, "A son has been born to Naomi." And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Boaz steps in. He becomes the Redeemer. He marries Ruth. And a whole new future is mapped out for them. A future that was bleak, a future that had no prosperity, a future that was etching out of living is transformed in this moment that Ruth now has a new husband. The family line will continue. That Naomi has a grandchild now who will carry on her husband's name and her son's name and will receive their inheritance. And the future is transformed in a moment because of this redemption. An heir is born. Obed would inherit the property. He would continue the family line. But it doesn't just change their family circumstances. It changes the history of Israel. Because the son will become the great-grandfather of King David. But notice what it says about Ruth. It relates her to Rachel and Leah. It relates her to the house of Perez and to Tamar, who bore Judah. She isn't seen as a Moabite woman who's come into Israel any longer. She is seen as an Israelite. She is integrated into the community. She is one of them. She belongs. She is in this community. She is loved by Yahweh. She is a daughter of Yahweh. She is brought into this community. She is no longer seen as a foreigner and someone who is distant and way off. She is brought in. Everything has changed in this redemption. And this is of important spiritual significance for us. This is what Christ does for us, church. He gives all of us a new future in him. Now, that doesn't mean we don't go through hardship. We will all go through hardship until he comes. That is the nature of life. Until Jesus comes, we still live in a fallen world. We still live among sin. We still live with sinful temptations within us. We still live in a world that is filled with sin, where people do sinful things. We all go through hardship. Our bodies have not been redeemed yet. We have not received resurrected bodies. There's hardship that still lies before us, but we have a new future, church. We have been redeemed, and our future is made new. And so we don't live in despair of our circumstances because we know what the future holds. And we've been adopted by God. We've been brought into his family. We've been given a new future and a new hope. And that does change things here and now. It does change our approach to things. When Paul writes about the suffering we go through, do you know the words that he uses to describe the suffering? Light and momentary. How can Paul, who's been through lots of suffering, who's been stoned and whipped and rejected and abused, and people have tried to kill him, and how can he describe the suffering that we go through as light and momentary? The only way suffering can be described as light and momentary is when you know the future that stretches out for all eternity is fully blessed and fully guaranteed, and God's given you a new future. Amen. It's the only way. Otherwise, the suffering that we go through for 70, 80, 90 years on earth isn't light and momentary. It's hard and difficult and seems to last forever and go on and on and on and on, and there's no end to it. But in the scheme of eternity, the suffering we have here now is light and momentary because of the future that God has given to us. And so we need vision that sees beyond just here and now. We need vision that sees the great and the new future that Christ has redeemed us for and that we will enjoy forever. And so, church, this story of Ruth is a story of determined faith that is birthed in hardship, that leans into and comes to know redemption, that is given a new future despite the pain and the hardship that she has been through.